The year was 60 AD, and the city of Rome pulsed like a living heart of stone and iron. From its marble temples to its foul-smelling alleys, everything thrummed with the same rhythm, the rhythm of power. Beneath that grandeur, under the sandals of senators and the wheels of golden chariots, millions lived invisible lives. They were the backbone of the empire. Yet they owned nothing, not even their names. The Romans called them servi, slaves. In the blazing sun of the Forum, traders shouted prices as human bodies stood displayed like livestock. Greek scribes, Syrian cooks, Gaulish warriors captured in battle, Egyptian farmers, all stripped bare, examined and sold. Their skin told their stories, whip marks across backs, burns from branding irons, inked numbers or crude tattoos declaring ownership. Among them stood one man named Callistus. He had once been a farmer's son from Epirus, taken during a Roman raid when his village refused to pay tribute. He was tall, sinewed, his eyes a deep brown that still carried the memory of mountain rain. As he waited for inspection, a Roman merchant prodded his arm, pried open his mouth, and nodded in approval. Within moments, the auctioneer's hammer fell. Callistus was sold for 1,800 sesterces. Cheap for a strong body with no known rebellion in him. The crowd dispersed, and Callistus was led away by chain, bound to others. They walked through the narrow streets where wealthy citizens passed by without a glance. To the Romans, slaves were tools, animated property. They worked the fields, cooked the meals, built the roads, and even poured the wine that senators drank while debating human virtue. The world of Rome was a pyramid of power. At the top stood the emperor and the senate. Below them, free citizens who enjoyed rights, leisure, entertainment. And at the bottom, the more than two-thirds of the population who lived in servitude. A slave's life could be brutal or bearable, depending entirely on fortune or the nature of their master. Callistus was purchased by Quintus Cassianus, a wealthy landowner who oversaw a vast estate near Capua. It was a world famous for its gladiator schools and brutal punishments. The journey south was long. Shackled to a cart, Callistus saw the endless stretch of Roman roads, the monumental aqueducts slicing across valleys, the power of an empire that had consumed hundreds of nations. He understood then that his former life had ended. Rome was not just a city, it was a machine that turned human suffering into brick and gold. When they reached the villa, the air smelled of olives and sweat. Overseers barked orders as slaves bent under baskets of fruit, pails of water, armfuls of firewood. Punishment poles lined the yard, darkened with old blood. The crucifixion beams stood in the distance like trees of death. Everyone knew what they meant. Callistus was assigned to field labor, to rise before dawn, toil under the fierce sun, and sleep on straw. His food was coarse grain and leftover broth. Still, there was life in him. Every morning he heard the slaves whisper rumors, the story of Spartacus, the gladiator who had fought Rome itself and almost won. Though 30 years had passed since that rebellion, the name still sparked quiet hope, but those who whispered too loudly vanished. The empire never forgot rebellion. Sometimes, after sunset, Callistus saw the silhouettes of crucified men along the nearby roads. Their bodies hung for days, warning that disobedience had only one end. Rome used crucifixion for the lowest of the low, for slaves, rebels and thieves. It was not just execution, it was theatre. Each body nailed to wood proclaimed a lesson. Defy Rome and die slowly, with the sky as your only witness. Yet, even among this despair, small sparks of life persisted. In the slave quarters, Callistus befriended Lydia, a housemaid from the east. She spoke of her children sold into other households. Her voice carried no tears, only emptiness. They shared stories, laughter stolen from pain. It was dangerous to hope, but human hearts were stubborn things. For months, Callistus endured. Summer became autumn. The overseer's whip drew blood across his shoulders until the scars blended into a single red map of endurance. But deep inside, a quiet fire began to grow. The more he suffered, the more he wondered, did the gods see what Rome had built? Was there mercy for those who had none left to give? Then one morning, word spread through the estate. A group of slaves in a nearby province had tried to flee. The patrols caught them before they reached the hills. Their fate was to be made an example. The crucifixions were ordered before sunset across the Appian Way where travelers could watch as they rode past. As the slaves were nailed to their crosses, the sound of their screams carried across the countryside. Callistus watched, and in that moment something inside him shifted, not in fear, but in awareness. Rome's might was built upon suffering, so organized, so normalized, that it had become invisible even to itself. The laughter of soldiers echoed under the evening sky, while the dying gasped for breath. And Callistus thought, if this is what Rome calls justice, what does it mean to be civilized? As twilight fell, a pale light crowned the dead along the highway. The wind stirred the olive trees, whispering through the fields like a silent rebellion. Callistus turned from the road, his heart pounding with a thought he dared not speak even to himself. What if one day those nailed hands would rise, not in prayer, but in defiance? Night fell heavy over the Capuan countryside. The cries from the crucifixions had faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that pressed on every heart. The stars shone above as they always did, calm, distant, uncaring. In the slave quarters, the air hung thick with smoke from oil lamps and the faint smell of unwashed bodies. Sleep came to few. Callistus lay awake on his straw bed. The faces of the crucified men haunted him. He saw their eyes open, glassy under the dying sun, mouths twisted not in fear but in rage. He wondered if they had dreamed once, like he did now, of freedom. Somewhere beyond those hills was life without chains, but no one had ever reached it and lived. The next morning, the overseer Lucanus arrived before dawn. He was a broad man, scarred from old campaigns, his right eye blinded by war. The slaves feared him more than hunger. He carried a whip plaited from bull's hide. Its sound cracked like thunder, its touch cut through flesh like fire. Beside him marched two guards armed with short swords, the silent keepers of Roman order. "All slaves to the fields," he barked. "You will work until the sun bleeds dry." Callistus staggered into line with the others. The field stretched before them like a vast sea of dust. At its far edge, crosses from yesterday's punishment still stood. Birds circled them. Death drew carrion as life drew breath. No one spoke as they began to dig and hoe. Every movement drew sweat and pain, but pain no longer mattered. It was the only language they all understood. Lydia worked nearby, her tunic clinging to her with dust and sweat. Once she had sung softly while working, her voice a thread of warmth in the cruelty. But now she worked in silence, eyes fixed on the ground. The slaves were careful not to draw Lucanus's attention. He could strike without reason. Near midday, a younger slave stumbled, too weak from hunger. Lucanus struck him down, and when the boy failed to rise, he was dragged away. No one saw him again. That night, in the corners of the slave quarters, whispers began. Talk of escape, faint, fragile, dangerous. One man, an older slave named Gaius, spoke quietly to Callistus. "We outnumber them 10-1, he said, eyes darting to the door. "If we took their weapons, if we fled by night—" His voice trailed off. They all knew what happened to those who tried and failed. The crosses on the Appian Way stood as endless proof. Still, the idea rooted itself in Callistus's mind. The thought of rebellion was like a forbidden fruit, sweet and poisonous. For the first time, he began to see the empire itself as a living creature that fed on their lives. Every stone in Rome's walls, every triumphal arch, every temple was soaked in blood. Days turned into weeks. The olive harvest drew near, the hardest season. The slaves slept little, ate less, and worked until their spines felt like iron. A few collapsed and were left to die where they fell. Among the Romans, mercy was weakness. Even the gods of Rome seemed to demand sacrifice. One afternoon, Quintus Cassianus arrived from Rome to inspect his estate. Draped in white linen and gold, carried in a litter by slaves, he looked upon his human property as a farmer might view his fields. Beside him walked a guest, a young senator's son sent to study rural management. They spoke in casual tones about profit margins, loss of labor, and slave discipline, with not a word about the suffering that bought their wealth. As Cassianus passed, his eyes met Callistus's for a brief moment. There was no recognition there, only ownership. He saw not a man, but an instrument of work, meat given breath. That night, Cassianus ordered new punishments for desertion rumors. Several slaves were hauled before the courtyard, accused of plotting escape. They were whipped until blood pooled at their feet, then branded on their foreheads with the letter F. It stood for fugitivus, runaway, a mark of shame that would follow them even in death. Callistus forced himself to watch. Turning away was dangerous, but watching was worse. Lydia stood behind him, trembling, her hand reaching to grip his arm. Her voice was a whisper. "They will do this to all of us someday." That night, when the guards had gone and the lamps burned low, Callistus found himself staring at the small flame flickering in an oil cup. How fragile it was against the wind, yet it refused to die. He felt something stirring within him again. It was not simply anger now, but clarity. He understood that fear was Rome's greatest weapon. It held more power than any whip or sword. In the darkness, Gaius approached him again. "There's a caravan passing through Capua in 3 nights," he said. "If we can slip out to the hills before dawn, we might reach the coast. There are ships that take fugitives north. There's a chance." Callistus hesitated. Hope was dangerous, but hopelessness was death that never ended. He looked around at the others, thin faces lit by small trembling flames. People who still dreamed, though the world refused to see them as people at all. He made a choice. "We go," he said. Time slowed. Outside, the wind moaned through the olive trees, bending their leaves like whispering voices of the dead. The crucified men on the roadside still hung there, silent and broken, but their silence demanded something. The empire's message was clear: disobey and die in agony. But what if the greatest defiance was to live beyond fear itself? As the 3rd night drew near, the plan set in motion. Keys stolen, schedules memorized, paths mapped in the dirt with trembling fingers. A few would go, too many would fail, but Callistus had already decided. Rome had crucified countless bodies. It would not crucify his soul. Under a pale moon, he whispered to Lydia, "If we fail, we die free." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the dark. "Then let's make them remember it." As they slipped into the night, shadows among shadows, not one of them could know that the fate awaiting them would be worse than anything they had ever imagined, that beyond the crucifixions lay even darker punishments, crafted not for obedience, but for terror. The night air over Capua was cool, but hearts burned hot with fear and hope. The moonlight traced pale lines across the earth as Callistus and the small band of fugitives slipped through the olive groves, feet brushing the dry soil like whispers. Each carried nothing but scraps of bread, a stolen flask of water, and the flicker of belief that freedom might still exist somewhere beyond Rome's reach. Behind them, The villa slept, its torches guttering in the courtyards, guards pacing lazily along the gates. They had waited until the third watch of the night, when men grew drowsy and careless. Now every heartbeat sounded like a drum of war in Callistus's chest. The chain that once bound him had been cut, but the fear of being caught felt heavier than iron. The road ahead wound toward the forested hills. If they could reach the dense woods before dawn, they might vanish into terrain the Romans rarely patrolled. Lydia moved beside him, her breath sharp and fast. Behind them followed Gaius and 4 others. Every twig that cracked beneath their feet felt like a betrayal. The silence itself seemed alive, waiting for the shout that would end it all. But the shout never came. For hours, only the steady rhythm of flight, the smell of damp earth, and the pounding of blood in their ears filled the night. By dawn, they reached the edge of a ravine. Below, a thin stream cut through the rock, and the forest thickened ahead. Callistus motioned for the group to stop and rest. They huddled among boulders, gasping for breath. The first rays of light painted the sky crimson like blood stretched across heaven. For a moment, it felt real. Freedom, no overseer, no whip, only the sound of water and wind through leaves. Lydia looked to the east, where the rising sun touched the far hills. "So that's it," she whispered. "All that pain, and we are still alive." Callistus gave a faint smile. For now. But hope was a fragile thing in the empire of chains. Before midday, they heard horses. Faint at first, then closer, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves on stone. A patrol. The Romans moved fast when chasing runaways. Dogs barked in the distance. Gaius's face turned white. "They're coming from the road," he said in panic. "If we stay, we die here." They scattered into the trees, branches whipping their faces as they ran. Callistus pulled Lydia behind him, down into a gully hidden by reeds. The sound of the dogs grew louder. He could hear the guards shouting orders, Latin words sharp as knives. "Stop, servi fugitivi." The spear flew. It caught Gaius in the chest as he turned. Callistus lunged for Lydia, dragging her deeper into the undergrowth. As screams tore through the morning, more soldiers crashed through the forest. The world became chaos, shouts, steel, the muffled thud of blows. Callistus fought back with a stolen hoe handle, striking one of the men, but there were too many. A blade slammed into his shoulder. He fell, the world spinning to red. When he woke, the sky had dimmed again. He was bound, wrists tied behind his back, his face pressed into the dirt. Lydia lay nearby, bruised and bleeding but alive. Around them, Roman soldiers laughed, their horses snorting in the dusk. Gaius and the others were dead or dying. Lucanus, the overseer, stood before them now, having led the pursuit. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost bored. "You thought you could run. You thought freedom was for slaves." He gestured, and the guards hauled Callistus upright. "You'll be made an example," he said. "The master demands punishment beyond crucifixion. There are worse ways to die." Fear clawed through Callistus's chest, but something colder settled beneath it. He met Lucanus's one good eye with a look that held no submission. The overseer struck him across the face with an iron rod, but Callistus did not cry out. They were marched back to the estate at nightfall. The road seemed longer now, the crosses along the Appian Way like old ghosts watching in silence. Rain began to fall, thin and cold. The drops mingled with blood and dust on Callistus's skin until he no longer knew what belonged to the sky or to himself. At the villa gates, Cassianus awaited them. The torches lit his sharp profile, his white cloak unstained by the world around him. He looked at the captives and shook his head slowly, almost with disappointment. "Lucanus," he said, "these slaves have forgotten their place. See that they remember Lucanus bowed deeply. Yes, Dominus. The pit has not been used in months. It will serve. The pit. Even the word made the other slaves shrink in terror. It was reserved for the worst offenders, those who challenged Roman control. A punishment older than the cross, designed not merely to kill, but to erase. The condemned were lowered inside and left, not for days, but for weeks. Sometimes they were fed to beasts, sometimes to one another. Callistus's breath caught. Lydia turned her face toward him, eyes wide, trembling. There was no mercy in Rome. There was only spectacle. They were dragged toward the far side of the estate, where a wooden trapdoor began a descent into blackness. The guards held torches that glimmered off the wet stone rim. The air that rose from below stank of rot and iron. Lucanus stopped before them, lips curling into a grin. "You wanted freedom," he said softly. "You will find it in the dark." As Callistus was forced toward the pit's edge, the torchlight flickered across his face. The abyss yawned below, swallowing sound itself. Every instinct screamed to fight, to live, but even now, something inside him refused to break. He turned his head and whispered to Lilia, the faintest thread of voice escaping his cracked lips. "Don't forget the sun, even here." Then they pushed him forward, and the darkness closed around him like the jaws of a beast. When Callistus struck the ground, the pain exploded through his ribs and knees. He lay gasping, the sound of his breath echoing off cold stone walls. Above, the trapdoor slammed shut with a heavy thud, sealing him inside. For a few heartbeats, the world was nothing but blackness and the steady drip of water. Then came the smell, sickly and sour, the stench of decay. He could not see his hand before his face, but he could feel the stone floor slick with moisture, the air thick and hot like breath trapped for centuries. Somewhere in that dark, something moved, a soft scrape like bone across stone. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. A whisper replied from the shadows, hoarse and trembling. "Another one?" The voice came closer. A shape shifted, barely human, a thin figure with hollow eyes that caught the faint glimmer of torchlight leaking through cracks in the wood above. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was parchment against bone, his hair matted and grey. "There were 10 of us once," the stranger said. "Now, 3. Callistus's throat tightened. "How long have you been here?" The man's laughter came low, almost mad. "Long enough that the stars forgot my name. They throw us down here to feed the others, or the rats, whichever comes first." From the far corner came the soft moan of another, a woman's voice, weak and lost. "No more," she murmured over and over, rocking herself into a fragile rhythm. Callistus crawled toward where she sat. His hands brushed against iron rings fixed in the walls. The Romans had built this pit as they built everything, with precision, with cruelty calculated inch by inch. He touched the woman's arm gently. Her skin burned with fever. "They will not open the door for days," the old man said. "Some die before it happens. Some wish to." Above them, faint shouts echoed as life continued in the world he could no longer see. The guards laughing, the sound of horses stamping, the empire's ordinary noise. For those below, Rome was reduced to a ceiling of wood and the weight of endless, rotting air. As turned into what might have been days, the pit blurred time. Thirst came first, a dry fire clawing the throat, then hunger, dull but constant. Callistus shared what little food the guards occasionally dropped, a crust of mouldy bread, a jug of stale water. The others ate like ghosts, afraid of waking the dead. In the dark, memory became everything. He saw his village again, the olive groves of Epirus, the sound of his mother's voice calling him home through the rain. He saw freedom not as a place, but as a memory, fading in his mind like smoke. Sometimes the trapdoor creaked open for an instant, just long enough for a Roman guard to drop a torch or another condemned slave into the pit. One evening, they brought Lydia. Her body struck the ground near him with a cry that twisted his heart. He stumbled across the stone and found her hand. It trembled as she pressed it to his face. "They said you were dead," she whispered, voice breaking. They were almost right. They clung to each other in the dark, wordless, as footsteps retreated above. The trapdoor sealed again, leaving them both to the heavy night. The pit became their world. They counted hours by whispers, traced old carvings in the stone, fragments of words left by those who had died long before them. Lydia sang softly sometimes, songs from her homeland, faint and ghostly. The sound filled the pit like light that never reached the eyes. But death walked close. The old man died one morning without a sound. They buried him with stones scavenged from the floor. Another died 2 nights later. Soon, only Callistus and Lydia remained. The guards began lowering food less often. There was no water for days. Callistus's body wasted, his mind slipped into strange visions, the faces of the crucified along the Appian Way, the laughter of Roman masters echoing in the dark. Once he thought he saw a light beam cut through the ceiling, thin and pure, and he reached for it. But it was only a crack bleeding air. Lydia pressed his hand to her chest. "If we die here," she whispered, "promise me. Don't let them take all of us, not in spirit." He nodded, but something deep in him rebelled. Rome could chain the body, starve the flesh, crush the will, but could it truly own the soul? When the trapdoor finally opened again, it was not with mercy. Soldiers peered down, holding torches. Lucanus's voice came cold and distant. "Bring up the survivors," he said. "The master wishes to display them." 2 slaves descended with ropes. Callistus and Lydia were hauled upward into blinding daylight. The air hurt his eyes. The sun was cruel after so long in the dark. The crowd of other slaves gathered silently as they were dragged into the courtyard. Cassianus stood near his dais, his expression smooth, detached, as if watching the harvest of a field. "These 2 tried to escape the order of Rome," he said aloud, his voice carrying over the yard. "They defied the will of their betters. Let their end teach all who would dream of rebellion." Lucanus smirked. "The cross, Dominos?" Cassianus shook his head slowly. "No, the cross is mercy. We will remind them that the empire's reach extends even beneath the soil. Let the beasts of the arena taste their flesh." A murmur spread through the slaves. Capua's amphitheatre loomed not far away, second only to the Colosseum in Rome itself. There, thousands had died for sport. It was not punishment, it was entertainment. Callistus realized then that even the pit had not been Rome's worst cruelty. The true horror was this: their deaths were to amuse others. He turned to Lydia, his voice steady despite the blood on his lips. "Then we die before the crowd, but we will not bow." That afternoon, bound in chains, they were marched toward the gates of Capua's arena. The sound of cheering already filled the air, tens of thousands of voices rejoicing for blood. The sun burned high above, and the city that fed on slaves prepared its feast. As the gates creaked open and the sand stretched before them like a sea of fire, Callistus felt only one thought rise clear from the chaos. If this was Rome's glory, then its foundation was built on the bones of the uncounted, and someday even empires must answer for their sins. The roar struck him like a storm. When Callistus stepped into the blinding light of Capua's arena, the sound of the crowd was deafening. Thousands of voices thundering above, echoing off the stone walls like the heartbeat of a god gone mad. The heat of the sun mixed with the copper scent of blood already soaked into the sand. Around him rose the walls lined with marble tiers, every seat filled with citizens eager to watch death. Lydia stood beside him, pale but upright, her wrists chained. Across the arena's expanse, the gates on the opposite side groaned open. A team of handlers led in beasts, starved leopards, black wolves brought from the mountains, even a bear scarred from 100 previous kills. The beasts snarled at the scent of human flesh. Roman soldiers stood by the imperial box. Cassianus reclined in the front row, shaded by a silken canopy. His face was calm, untouched by the cries of the condemned. To him, this was order, justice, amusement. Lucanus, in armor now, stood near the edge of the arena with a whip in hand. He met Callistus's gaze and called out, "Run, slave, make it worth their coin." The crowd laughed. Callistus looked at the faces above, the patricians draped in fine robes, women leaning forward eagerly, children cheering as the beasts were goaded closer. Then he turned to Lydia. She met his eyes, and for a heartbeat the noise vanished. There was only the two of them, standing against the entire weight of the empire. "Stay close," he said quietly. The handlers released the beast. Chaos erupted. A leopard sprinted across the sand, claws tearing furrows. Callistus moved fast, dragging Lydia behind him toward the wall. The beast leapt, its roar filling his ears. But he caught a jagged bone from the sand, the remains of another victim, and jammed it upward as it struck. The point caught its throat. Blood sprayed across his arm as the animal thrashed and fell. The crowd's roar turned to confusion. Some shouted in surprise, others cheered. To them, this was only better entertainment. Another gate opened. A gladiator stepped out, bare-chested, helmeted, wielding a trident and net. An old champion, once a slave himself, now fighting for reward. His name was Caius, the Lion of Capua. His scars crisscrossed his body like a map of survival. He looked at Callistus, then at Cassianus above, and hesitated. The crowd howled for blood. A guard struck Chaos across the shoulder, shouting. The man's jaw tightened. His orders were clear. Kill the runaways. He advanced slowly across the sand. Callistus picked up a broken spear haft left near the wall. The air shivered with the crowd's anticipation. When the two men met in the arena's center, the noise became a hurricane of voices. Steel met wood. Callistus blocked, swung, ducked. The gladiators' strikes were powerful but measured. And then Caius whispered between blows, so low only Callistus heard, "Hold firm. When I turn, run left. The gate will open." Callistus blinked in confusion, but before he could answer, Caius swung wide with his trident, knocking him to the ground, convincing the crowd that the fight was real. The guards above cheered. Caius advanced, raising his weapon again, shouting to them, "For Rome!" But instead of striking down, he spun toward the nearest guard at the periphery and drove the trident clean through his chest. The man's scream tore the air. At the same instant, Caius kicked the gate controls beside him. The mechanism clanged. The smaller holding gate burst open. Callistus didn't wait to understand. He grabbed Lydia's arm. Together they sprinted toward the open passage, sand kicking behind their feet. The crowd erupted in shock, half gasping, half roaring their approval. Another guard tried to intercept them, but Caius threw himself forward, blocking the way. 3 more soldiers fell as he fought them, buying mere seconds. "Go!" he shouted. Through the gate, Callistus and Lydia plunged into the darkness of the passage. The sound of the arena thundered behind them. Guards shouting, iron clattering, beasts roaring again. They climbed upward through echoing stone tunnels, breathing hard. The passage twisted, leading to the outer training compound. A door loomed ahead, a service exit that opened onto the narrow road behind the arena. They burst into daylight again, blinking, gasping. The streets of Capua stretched before them. For a moment, it seemed they might make it, but from behind came the sound of Roman horns, the alarm spreading through the city. Callistus stumbled, blood running from his reopened wounds. Lydia caught him, panting. "Keep going," she said. They reached the edge of the olive groves before the horsemen appeared on the hill. Torches, spears, gleaming helmets. They were surrounded again, but this time there was no fear in his chest, only calm. Lydia's hand squeezed his. A centurion rode forward, his sword drawn. "You cannot escape Rome," he said flatly. "No one does." Callistus lifted his head. "No," he said hoarsely, "but Rome cannot escape what it's built." He stepped forward and struck the centurion's horse across the face with a loose chain. The animal reared. The soldiers surged toward them. The world dissolved into shouts and flashes of metal. When it ended, the bodies of the fugitives lay among the trees. The centurion wiped his blade, offering no thought to the fallen. The slaves' bodies were hung at dawn on the same crosses that marked the Appian Way, a warning stretching deep into the heart of Italy. Yet the empire did not notice that something greater had taken root. Among other slaves across the provinces, whispers began to stir, rumors of those who had defied the masters, who fought and died as free men. Their names faded, but their stories spread from house to house, field to field, camp to camp. Rome could crucify bodies, it could silence voices, but it could never kill the idea that one day the chains would break. Generations later, when the empire itself rotted from within, when the proud marble of the Colosseum began to crumble and weeds grew through its cracks, the wind still carried faint echoes from that ancient arena, the sound of slaves who refused to bow. Their blood marked not the triumph of Rome, but its beginning end.